Our next presenter is Ramesh Govindaraj. He's the lead health specialist from the World Bank, and he will be speaking to us about the increasing role of Asia in the global generic pharmaceutical industry. Please join me in welcoming Ramesh.
Well, now that I've demonstrated how technologically challenged I am, first of all, let me take the opportunity of thanking the Rockefeller Center for inviting me to present. Not that I needed any excuse to come back and wander around Harvard Yard. It's been over 20 years since I was last here, so any opportunity to come back, I think, is more than welcome. I've been asked to speak about the increasing role of Asia in the global pharmaceutical industry, and I propose to approach it from two different perspectives. One of Asia as a market for pharmaceuticals and the fastest growing market globally. And the second, its role as a producer and exporter, particularly of generic drugs, which has particular relevance for the Latin American market, as you've heard. I'm going to start this presentation with sort of a Japanese approach to starting presentations, which is starting with an apology. Because in speaking to Veronica, she had given me the impression that the audience was mostly people who didn't know the first word of pharmaceuticals, and that I should therefore start from first principles. And perhaps I might have taken that advice a bit too seriously in the way I have. So if a lot of this sounds somewhat basic, I'll just try to speed through it so that we keep it at a level where it's still interesting. I'm going to skip this. This was part of the process of trying to introduce people to sort of basic concepts. But I think most of the audience here is familiar with it. We have already talked about originator brands, branded generics, and generics. Perhaps the one concept that we have not referred to is this concept of APIs or active pharmaceutical ingredients or bulk drugs. Which are the basic sort of chemical entities which are used to, along with excipients, to make the ultimate formulation. And the reason this is important in the Asian context is that many countries in Asia are actually focusing on the production and export of APIs as opposed to the ultimate formulations. And I'll try to sort of bring that up as I go along. Asia is sort of, in the broader context of a global pharmaceutical market, which is expected to grow to 1.2 trillion by 2017. The real action is in the Asian countries. If you compare that to the more mature markets in North America, Europe, and Japan, where the growth rates typically average between 1% and 3% annual growth rates, and you compare that to the Asia-Pacific region, where we are talking about growth rates of between 12 and 14%, you can see why increasingly we expect to see Asia emerge as perhaps the largest and the fastest growing market for pharmaceuticals. Looking at this from sort of another perspective, and I think what this slide brings out, which wasn't there in the other one, is the increasing importance of Latin America as a market for pharmaceuticals, because I think Latin America gives a run for the money to the Asian countries in terms of growth rates, which are very comparable. And I think that in terms of global trade in pharmaceuticals, this is going to become increasingly important. Now, in terms of the markets within individual countries in the Asia-Pacific, China is the 600-pound gorilla in the room, and primarily because of the very large size of its domestic market. If you look at the numbers, which despite the large numbers have actually almost doubled between 2012 and 2017, China clearly dominates Asia as a market for pharmaceuticals. But the other countries actually play a fairly significant role. So countries like India, Korea, Indonesia, Taiwan in particular are all growing very rapidly, and they're all large markets. And then there are countries like Vietnam, which admittedly are starting from a small base, but are still showing very, very pronounced growth rates in terms of the market. So in terms of where pharmaceuticals are headed going forward, the Asia-Pacific is becoming increasingly prominent. And the reason for that is obvious. You have very large population countries, many of which spend on a per capita basis a fairly small amount on pharmaceuticals. And with economic growth, with the development of populations, and a variety of other factors, some of which has been alluded to earlier, this is where the real growth is going to happen. So in addition to the two I don't know what color one would call it, I guess purple, India and China, which are the big markets, you have others which are very significant, including countries like Bangladesh, which, in addition to their increasing importance in the production of pharmaceuticals, are also very large markets, and Philippines and Vietnam and so on. And the other observation, which I think came out in some of the previous presentation, is that increasingly the multinational companies are yielding to generics in terms of drugs that are being marketed in these countries. And you will see that across East Asia, all of these countries are in East Asia, in a majority of the countries, the originator has less than a 50% market share and have been losing it year on year, with the exception of Singapore, which is on the extreme right. And you know, the generics market is where the action is within East Asia. And this is also true for other parts of the world. And there are a variety of reasons. Again, we have discussed some of this, and you've heard other speakers on this. The loss of exclusivity, patents basically dying out, cost containment efforts, both from government regulation and mandates from the government, as well as payer pressures, prescribing action, the important role that consumer activists are playing, have all played a role in increasing the importance of generics that you observe here. This slide actually talks about Asia as a global pharmaceutical producer and exporter. And most of the exports have actually focused on generics. Although of late, particularly in the last 4 or 5 years, many of the Indian and Chinese companies have embarked on research and development, and new drugs are emerging, whether it's in the form of improvements in generics, whether it's in the form of new dosage, it's new methods of delivering the drug, and so on. There have been some innovation. But predominantly, the exports are in the form of generics. And what you will see here is that there is a variation across the countries in terms of how much these countries actually import and export pharmaceuticals. In terms of exports, countries like India clearly dominate. There's a huge gap between the exports from India across the world and the amount of pharmaceuticals that it actually imports. And you can contrast that to China, where the imports of raw materials, finished formulations, and so on is very significant. But nevertheless, the export from China is still very, very large. And this is a trend that you can expect to see grow as we move forward. And I think this is reflected in this particular slide, where if you look at the global market leaders for generic drugs and the top 15 in terms of overall generic sales, roughly 5 of the 15 top companies are actually from India, with Sun Pharmaceuticals leading the way, but a number of other Indian companies, such as Aurobindo's, Dr. Reddy's Laboratories, Cipla, and so on, represented there. And you would expect many of these companies to actually move up the ranks as we go forward, if past trends are any indication. So in terms of Asian pharmaceutical exports to Latin America, India and China are the biggest suppliers of both APIs as well as finished drugs. But as I mentioned earlier, there are other Asian countries which are rapidly growing as well. And countries like Korea, Taiwan, Thailand, and Singapore have become significant players in this market. There was a lot of reference in previous presentations to an increasing focus on regulation, and particularly on the regulation of quality. And I think that both China and India have realized that if they want to keep the markets growing in many of these countries, it's going to become increasingly important for them to focus on quality assurance for their exports. And there's a great deal of effort across these countries to ensure that their firms are actually accredited by the medical regulatory agencies in the more advanced countries, such as in the US, Europe, UK, Canada, and so on and so forth. And it's not a coincidence that India has more firms accredited by the FDA than any other country in the world except for the US itself. So I think that shows you the importance of quality and the recognition by the firms that this is going to be an area of focus as they move forward. Now, Indian pharmaceutical exports to Latin America in 2016 were about 651 million. which is roughly 8% of its total global exports. And this number is likely, the percentage is likely to go up, as you will see in the trend figure that I'll present shortly. And China is a close second with 404 million. And the relative positions and the relative levels of exports of these generics between India and China have been more or less consistent over the last 5 years. So just a very quick overview of the Indian pharmaceutical industry. It's an assortment of all sorts of firms. There are over 24,000 production units, pharmaceutical production units in India. But basically, there are about 300 large or medium firms and 9,000 small-scale producers, some of which have more than one unit, which explains the 24,000 number. Constitutes roughly 3.6% of the global pharmaceutical industry by value and about 10% by volume. And in particular, in the generics market, they have a very, very prominent role because the share of Indian pharmaceutical firms is 20% of the global generics market. It's the second largest contributor of pharma and biotech workforce after the US. And as I mentioned, it has more FDA-approved production facilities than virtually any other country. And one of the things that you observe amongst the many changes that are happening in the Indian pharmaceutical industry is an increasing focus on moving from sort of chemical-based pharmaceuticals to biotech-based products. And the advantage that India has in pharmaceutical manufacture is I guess, twofold. One at the macro level, by virtue of sort of economic drivers and policy support that is available from the government, as well as at the micro level, the cost efficiency advantages that India enjoys, and the diversification of its portfolio. I mean, it's pretty amazing that India actually has over 60,000 generic brands across 60 therapeutic categories that it exports around the world. China's pharmaceutical manufacturers are somewhat different. Again, like India, they have numerous producers of varying sizes. And in 2017, they actually came up with a new categorization of their pharmaceutical companies based on market value. And these are the three tiers. I won't go into the details, but you will see that as the valuation goes down, the number of companies actually increases. And pharmaceutical sales in China have grown at an even faster rate than pharmaceutical sales in India, primarily, as I mentioned earlier, dominated by the huge market within China itself and the domestic sales that are happening. But the annual growth rates are huge, and it continues to be a very, very lucrative growth area going forward. Now, you've seen this slide, I think, in what Veronica put up. And she was kind enough to share this with me. But the only reason for putting it up again is to show that, in terms of pharmaceutical imports and pharmaceutical exports, if you look over the last 6 to 7 years, it has been more or less sort of constant. There haven't been very significant increases and decreases, either as a percentage of total trade or as a percentage of imports. But going forward, for a variety of reasons that other speakers have referred to, the pharmaceuticals growth in Latin America is expected to go up by leaps and bounds. This has to do with the commitment of many of the countries to universal health coverage that you heard a little bit about. It has to do with the emergence of many of these countries from economic recession to rapid growth. It has to do with the aging process, the rising importance of non-communicable diseases and drugs aimed at those diseases and so on. So my suspicion is that the trends might actually change going forward. And therefore, Latin America is a very attractive export market for the Asian pharmaceutical companies. I think I had alluded to this earlier. The pharmaceutical market growth in Latin America is second only to Asia. Brazil's market actually doubled in 5 years from 2013 to 2017. The pharmaceutical industry in Asia regards many of the Latin American countries as really extremely lucrative markets with high risk versus reward ratios. Brazil is by far the largest market, followed closely by Venezuela, whose share is beginning to drop off, interestingly, and Mexico is rapidly catching up. But a number of the other countries are prominent in terms of exports of pharmaceuticals. Interestingly, India exports more to Mexico than it does to Canada, Russia, Thailand, and Iran. So it's a significant market. Now, Asian countries also export APIs. In 2016, it was valued at about 300 million for local formulations and finishing, because many of the pharmaceutical firms in Latin America are increasingly importing APIs and using them for local formulations. And in addition to that, I think particularly Indian firms have recognized the importance of tying their lot with local entities in the Latin American market. And they're either setting up local manufacturing plants, as have a number of Indian pharmaceutical companies, and also moving towards joint ventures. For example, MCure with Biolab from Brazil, or Biocon with Laboratório. I can never get the Spanish pronunciation right, but PISA, shall we say, of Mexico in LAC. And this is, again, a slide that you have seen. The trend is clearly increasing, with the exception of Argentina, and perhaps the slight diminution, I suspect, as we move forward in Argentina and Brazil, because of what you had heard earlier about an increasing emphasis on regulation of the pharmaceutical industry. Otherwise, in the other countries, it's an expanding market going forward. Just a word about active pharmaceutical ingredient exports. This is, again, the projected growth rates are, for APIs is really large. And this market is actually dominated by China. So if you look at all the Asian countries, roughly 61% of the API production actually happens in China, and about 33% or 1/3 in India. But increasingly, other Asian countries like Taiwan and Korea are beginning to get into this, and they realize the value of this market. Now, I think I've covered most of what you see here. The API market in Latin America has huge potential, and in this instance, Mexico is the largest market, with Brazil catching up rapidly. And patent expiries and the wide use of synthetic APIs ensures that this market is likely to remain stable or grow as we go forward. And then more recently, biotech APIs have really begun to sort of explode, admittedly from a small base, but the rates of growth of biotech APIs is quite phenomenal. Just some reflections of where the industry might be heading, and this is my last slide. There are a number of challenges, and I think a lot of people have alluded to them already. Even within the generics industry, the competition is increasing considerably, including from originator firms, which increasingly are investing in generic companies within their system to basically tap into this expanding generics market. They're also moving to the extent possible, mitigate the threat of generics that happens with patent expirations through a variety of mechanisms. Again, some of which you've heard about: new formulations, new methods of use, potential combination products, and so on. And of course, there is payer pressure, customer consolidation, large buying groups, monopsonies, which can actually demand and get a better price. And the perceptions of quality of generics has also sort of dogged the Asian companies for a while. And so they have basically responded in several ways, and this is by no means an exhaustive list. But Asian companies, particularly the big ones, are focusing on products with limited API availability. The mid-sized firms are focusing either on niche markets or products with high profitability. Quality assurance is really sort of big in Asia. They realize that this is critical for their survival. And the governments are also getting to the act and actually supporting the industry in making investments in quality, as also industry associations. There has been a tremendous increase in partnership of Asian firms with Western firms based on technology exchanges and a variety of other things. And then the local firms, as I had mentioned earlier, are beginning to invest in R&D in a big way, including R&D in the OECD countries. To create sort of new product portfolios, new chemical entities, and new drug delivery systems. And within the API industry, more and more companies are focusing, because of the margins and so on, moving from synthetic APIs to actually biological APIs. So I think it's a very dynamic market which will continue to evolve, I'm sure, going forward. Thank you.